Stand on the corner of Clement's Lane today, near the roar of Aldwych traffic, and you will find a pavement plaque marking a vanished building. The stone is small. The words are spare. They tell you that beneath your feet once stood Enon Chapel, a place of worship that operated between 1823 and 1844. They do not tell you what happened inside. Every year, more than 3 million tourists walk within 200 yards of this spot on their way to Covent Garden. Not 1 in 10,000 knows the name Enon. But rewind 180 years, and you would have found a handsome neoclassical chapel with Doric columns, gas lamps glowing through tall windows, and the sound of hymns drifting into the narrow streets of Clare Market. You would have smelled roasting chestnuts from the costermongers' barrows. You would have heard fiddle music from the upper room on Saturday nights, where Londoners paid sixpence to dance. Death. Profit. Disease. Silence. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through 2 decades inside Enon Chapel, from the coffin stacked in its cellar to the floorboards that buckled under the weight of mourners, and the surgeon who finally forced London to face what it had buried beneath its own feet. Enon Chapel opened its doors in the spring of 1823. It stood on the southern edge of Clare Market, a tight labyrinth of alleys between the Strand and Lincoln's Inn Fields where butchers, rag pickers, and costermongers lived in tenements stacked 4 and 5 stories high. The chapel's builder was a man named William Howse, though the surviving parish records spell his name 3 different ways. He was not a clergyman. He was an entrepreneur. The building itself measured 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. The facade was respectable, Portland stone, fluted pilasters, a modest pediment. Inside, the nave held 200 wooden pews arranged in 8 rows. A pulpit stood at the eastern end, carved from deal pine and painted to resemble mahogany. Gas lamps hung from iron brackets along both walls, an expensive modern touch that gave the interior a warm amber glow on winter evenings. Howse hired a preacher named Willoughby to deliver Sunday services. Willoughby's theology leaned towards the emotional revivalist style popular in the 1820s, long sermons about redemption, short prayers for the dead. But the real business of Enon Chapel was not salvation. It was burial. Beneath the nave, Howse had excavated a cellar. The space measured 59 feet by 29 feet and was 6 feet deep, a brick-lined pit accessed by a trapdoor behind the pulpit. In the spring of 1823, Howse placed an advertisement in the Morning Chronicle. For £3.10, a family could bury their dead beneath the floorboards of a consecrated chapel in the heart of London. No need to travel to the overcrowded churchyards of St Giles or St Clement Danes. No need to fear the resurrection men who dug up fresh graves and sold cadavers to the anatomy schools on Windmill Street. Your loved ones would rest in a private vault, sealed and sanctified, under the protection of a man of God. The advertisement did not mention that the vault was a single shared pit. It did not mention that the coffins would be stacked like cordwood, each new arrival placed on top of the last. It did not mention that within 6 months, the cellar would hold more than 300 bodies, and that the air inside the chapel would begin to smell of something the parishioners could not name but could not ignore. By 1825, Enon Chapel was conducting an average of 11 burials per week. The coffins came down through the trapdoor on ropes. Most were elm, though the poorest families brought their dead in dealboard shells that splintered under the weight of the bodies above. Howse charged by the coffin, not by the grave. There were no individual plots. There was no registry of who lay where. The cellar was a common pit, and every coffin that entered was added to the heap. The process was simple. A family arrived with their dead. Willoughby conducted a short service, 10 minutes, sometimes less. Howse's men opened the trapdoor, lowered the coffin on 2 hemp ropes, and placed it wherever space remained. Then the trapdoor closed. The family returned to Clare Market. The next service began. By the end of 1825, the cellar held more than 600 bodies. By 1830, the number had passed 2,000. By 1835, it was 5,000. And still the burials continued. The mathematics was straightforward. The cellar's volume was approximately 10,000 cubic feet. An average adult coffin occupied 20 cubic feet, including the space required for stacking. 10,000 divided by 20 yields 500 coffins. But Enon Chapel buried 12,000 people in 21 years. The only way to fit them was to break the coffins open once the wood rotted, compact the remains, and stack new coffins directly on top of the exposed bones and decomposing flesh. Howse employed 2 men to manage the cellar. Their names do not survive in the parish records, but witnesses later described them as labourers from Clare Market, paid 2 shillings per burial. Their job was to make room. When the cellar filled, they descended with crowbars and hammers. They pried open the oldest coffins. They shoveled the contents, bones, hair, cloth, liquefied tissue, into the corners. They stacked the new arrivals on top. Then they climbed back up, closed the trap door, and waited for the next funeral. The smell became unbearable by 1828. Parishioners complained of a thick, sweet stench that clung to their clothes and hair. Some reported headaches during services. Others said they felt faint. Howse installed ventilation shafts in the floor, 6-inch iron pipes that ran from the cellar to the exterior wall, but the pipes only spread the odour into Clement's Lane, where passers-by gagged and covered their faces. In 1832, London suffered its first cholera epidemic. More than 6,000 people died in the city between February and September. Clare Market, one of the poorest and most densely packed neighbourhoods, lost 312 residents in 3 months. Enon Chapel buried them all. Medical opinion in 1832 blamed cholera on miasma, poisonous air rising from decomposing organic matter. The theory was wrong, but the fear was real. Londoners believed that the dead could kill the living simply by rotting in proximity. And in the case of Enon Chapel, they were not entirely mistaken. The cellar's ventilation shafts released hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, and cadaverine into the nave. Hydrogen sulfide causes nausea, dizziness, and respiratory distress. Ammonia burns the eyes and throat. Methane displaces oxygen. Cadaverine, the compound responsible for the smell of decaying flesh, triggers vomiting in concentrations as low as 1 part per million. The congregation shrank. By 1835, fewer than 50 people attended Sunday services. Howse replaced the hymns with dancing. On Saturday nights, he opened the upper room as a public hall. Fiddle players performed reels and jigs. Couples paid 6pence to dance on the floorboards above the dead. The dancers were not ghouls. They were not curiosity seekers drawn by morbid rumour. They were the residents of Clare Market, costermongers, laundresses, porters, sempstresses, the men and women who sold eels from barrows on Drury Lane and mended shirts in airless garrets above butchers' shops. They knew what lay beneath the floor. They danced anyway. This was not ignorance. This was necessity. In the London of the 1830s, death was everywhere. The average life expectancy in Clare Market was 27 years. 1 child in 3 died before the age of 5. Tuberculosis, typhus, and smallpox circulated constantly through the tenements. Bodies were a fact of life, and the smell of decay was as familiar as the smell of coal smoke or horse manure. If you refused to enter any building that housed the dead, you would never enter a church, a hospital, or half the homes in your own neighbourhood. The Saturday dances at Enon Chapel were popular because they were cheap. Most public halls charged 1 shilling or more for admission. Howse charged 6pence, and he threw in a cup of gin for an extra 3pence. The upper room was warm. The music was competent. The company was local. For 2 hours, you could forget the rent you owed, the cough your daughter couldn't shake, the ache in your spine from carrying baskets up 5 flights of stairs. You could move. You could laugh. You could touch someone. The floorboards creaked. Sometimes they sagged. In 1838, a section of the floor near the pulpit cracked during a crowded funeral, and mourners saw the corner of a coffin protruding through the gap. Howse nailed a plank over the hole and continued the service. The following Saturday, the dancing resumed. We know the names of some of the dancers because they later testified to a parliamentary committee. Mary and Tidy, a laundress, said she attended the chapel dances regularly between 1836 and 1839. She said the smell was strong but tolerable, and that she never felt ill. Thomas Rayner, a porter, said he danced there twice a month for 3 years. He said the floor felt spongy underfoot, especially near the trap door, and that the air tasted metallic. He said he stopped going after a friend collapsed during a reel and had to be carried outside. But the dancers who spoke to the committee were the survivors. The ones who did not survive, the ones who contracted typhoid or scarlet fever or cholera in the months after dancing at Enon Chapel, left no testimony. Victorian epidemiology could not trace infections to specific sources. If you died of fever in Clare Market, the cause was recorded as miasma, bad air, or simply fever. No one asked which buildings you had entered, which streets you had walked, which floorboards you had stood on. Modern microbiology tells a clearer story. The cellar of Enon Chapel was a pathogen incubator. The decomposing bodies produce not only toxic gases but also bacterial spores, Clostridium, Streptococcus, Mycobacterium. These spores drifted up through the floorboards and settled on clothing, skin, and food. They entered lungs. They colonized throats. They waited. The chapel's ventilation shafts, installed to reduce the smell, only made the contamination worse. The shafts created air currents that pulled spores from the cellar into the nave and out into Clement's Lane. Every funeral, every service, every dance released a cloud of microscopic death into the neighborhood. And still the burials continued. In 1840, Enon Chapel buried 943 people. In 1841, 812. In 1842, 706. The number declined not because Howse turned anyone away, but because the cellar was physically full. There was no more room. By 1842, the floor of the nave had sunk 3 inches below its original level. The weight of the decomposing mass below had compacted the soil, and the floorboards now rested directly on the uppermost layer of coffins. When you walked across the chapel, you were walking on wood that was less than 6 inches above human remains. When you knelt to pray, your knees pressed down on boards that flexed and groaned under the shifting weight of 12,000 dead. George Alfred Walker was a surgeon with a practice on Drury Lane, less than 300 yards from Enon Chapel. He was 31 years old in 1839, a graduate of the Middlesex Hospital Medical School, and a man with a reputation for meticulous record-keeping and an intolerance for incompetence. He had watched the cholera epidemic of 1832. He had dissected cadavers in the Anatomy Theatre at Great Windmill Street. He had walked through the burial grounds of St. Giles and St. Martin in the Fields and seen graves so shallow that dogs unearthed the coffins. But it was a conversation in a coffee house in the spring of 1839 that first drew his attention to Enon Chapel. A patient, a cloth merchant named Benjamin Corby, mentioned that he had attended a funeral there the previous week, and that the smell had been so overpowering that 2 mourners vomited during the service. Corby said the chapel's proprietor had apologized and blamed the drains. Walker asked where the bodies were buried. Corby said beneath the floor. Walker visited Clement's Lane the following day. He found the chapel empty and the doors locked. He walked around the building, examining the exterior walls. He found the ventilation shafts, 6 iron pipes, each 3 inches in diameter, protruding from the brickwork at ground level. He knelt beside one and smelled the air. The stench was immediate and unmistakable: hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and the sickly-sweet odor of putrefaction. He returned the following Sunday and attended a service. The nave held fewer than 30 people. The smell was so strong that Walker breathed through a handkerchief soaked in lavender oil. During the hymn, he walked to the rear of the chapel and examined the floorboards. He saw gaps between the planks, and through the gaps he saw darkness. He pressed his boot against a board near the wall. The wood flexed. After the service, Walker introduced himself to Howse and asked how many people were buried beneath the building. Howse said he did not keep exact records, but he estimated 3,000 or 4,000. Walker asked to inspect the cellar. Howse refused. Walker asked if the burials were licensed by the parish. Howse said they were consecrated by a minister of God and required no further authority. Walker left. Over the next 3 months, Walker investigated every burial ground and mortuary chapel within 2 miles of Drury Lane. He measured the size of the graveyards. He counted the graves. He interviewed sextons, undertakers, and clergymen. He compiled a table showing the number of burials per acre per year in each location. The numbers were appalling. The churchyard of St. Martin in the Fields held 69,000 bodies in an acre and a half of ground. The Portugal Street burial ground held 30,000 in half an acre. But Enon Chapel was the worst. Walker calculated that the building had buried 12,000 people in a space measuring 1/24 of an acre, a density of 288,000 bodies per acre, a figure so extreme that Walker initially assumed he had made an error in his arithmetic. He had not. In November 1839, Walker published his findings in a pamphlet titled Gatherings from Graveyards. The pamphlet was 40 pages long, printed on cheap paper, and sold for sixpence. It named Enon Chapel explicitly. It described the cellar as a cesspit of pestilence. It accused Howse of poisoning his congregation for profit. It called for the immediate closure of all intramural burial grounds in London. The pamphlet sold 3,000 copies in 2 weeks. It was reviewed in the Times, the Lancet, and the Morning Chronicle. Edwin Chadwick, the social reformer and architect of the Poor Law, read it and wrote to Walker offering his support. George Godwin, editor of The Builder, published excerpts and called for a parliamentary inquiry. And in Clare Market, the residents of Clement's Lane began to avoid the chapel. The Saturday dances stopped. The Sunday services dwindled. By the end of 1839, Enon Chapel was empty. But it was not yet closed. Howse continued to operate the burial business. Families still brought their dead. The coffin still went down through the trapdoor. And Walker, furious, began a campaign that would consume the next 4 years of his life and force Parliament to confront a question it had avoided for a century: where do you bury the dead in a city that has run out of ground? In 1842, Edwin Chadwick published his report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain. The report was 457 pages long. It described the water supply, the sewers, the housing conditions, and the burial practices of Britain's industrial cities. It called intramural burial a public health catastrophe. It cited George Walker's research extensively. And it recommended the immediate closure of all urban burial grounds and the construction of extramural cemeteries on the outskirts of every major city. The report was debated in Parliament in the spring of 1843. The debate lasted 6 hours. MPs argued about property rights, religious tradition, and the cost of exhuming and relocating hundreds of thousands of bodies. But the medical evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Southwood Smith, a physician and public health reformer, testified that the air inside London's burial grounds contained pathogenic particles that caused fever, typhus, and cholera. He said that children who lived within 50 yards of a burial ground were 3 times more likely to die before the age of 5 than children who lived 200 yards away. He said that Enon Chapel was the single worst example he had encountered in 30 years of practice. The debate ended without a vote. But the political momentum was unstoppable. In 1850, the Metropolitan Interments Act prohibited new burials in central London. In 1852, the Burial Act gave the government the power to close existing burial grounds and relocate the dead. Enon Chapel was one of the first buildings named in the closure orders. The exhumation began in October 1847, 5 years after the last burial. A team of labourers hired by the parish of St. Clement Danes opened the trapdoor and descended into the cellar. What they found exceeded even Walker's darkest predictions. The cellar was not merely full. It was heaped. Coffins were stacked to the ceiling in some places, crushed and splintered in others. The wooden sides had rotted away, leaving exposed bones, hair, and desiccated tissue piled in mounds. The floor was covered in a black, viscous sludge, a mixture of decomposed flesh, leached tannins from the coffins, and groundwater that had seeped through the brick walls. The smell was so overpowering that the laborers wore masks soaked in camphor and worked in 15-minute shifts. The remains of 12,000 people were removed over the course of 6 weeks. The workers shoveled the contents of the cellar into sacks and loaded them onto carts. The carts carried the sacks to Norwood Cemetery, a newly opened burial ground in South London, 7 miles from Clement's Lane. There, the remains were reburied in a mass grave and covered with quicklime. The cellar was then filled with rubble. The trapdoor was sealed. The chapel itself was demolished in 1848. The site was cleared, and the land was sold to a developer who built a row of tenements. The tenements stood until 1901, when they were demolished to make way for the Aldwych Kingsway redevelopment. The new road cut through the exact location of Enon Chapel's cellar. The engineers who excavated the site reported finding fragments of human bone in the soil, mixed with broken brick and coffin nails. Today, a plaque marks the spot. The plaque was installed in 1990 by the London Borough of Camden. It is small, bronze, set into the pavement. Most people walk past without noticing. The closure of Enon Chapel did not end intramural burial in London. It took another 5 years and a second cholera epidemic before Parliament passed the Burial Act of 1852, which finally prohibited burials within the city limits and mandated the creation of new cemeteries outside the metropolitan core. 7 great cemeteries were established between 1832 and 1841: Kensal Green, West Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Nunhead, Brompton, and Tower Hamlets, and these became the model for extramural burial across Britain. George Walker continued his campaign until his death in 1884. He published 3 more pamphlets, testified before 2 parliamentary committees, and personally investigated more than 200 burial grounds. He never accepted payment for his work. He said the dead deserved better than to be crammed into pits and forgotten. William Howse, the proprietor of Enon Chapel, disappeared from the historical record after 1847. No obituary was published. No will was probated. He was 53 years old at the time of the chapel's closure, and it is likely he lived another decade or more, but no contemporary source mentions him again. His name appears only in the parish records of St. Clement, Danes, in the burial registers he himself compiled, listing the names and dates of the 12,000 people he buried beneath his chapel floor. The Burial Act of 1852 changed the landscape of death in Britain. It ended the practice of burying the dead in the centres of cities. It established the principle that public health took precedence over religious tradition. It created the Victorian cemetery as we know it, landscaped, spacious, designed for contemplation rather than convenience. And it was built on the testimony of a surgeon who smelled the air outside a chapel on Clement's Lane and decided to count the bodies. Modern epidemiologists credit the act with preventing thousands of deaths. By moving burials out of densely populated neighborhoods, London reduced the transmission of waterborne and airborne diseases. The cholera epidemic of 1854 killed fewer than half as many people as the epidemic of 1832, in part because the sources of contamination, the burial grounds, had been closed. But the act came too late for the 12,000 buried at Enon Chapel. It came too late for the families who paid Howse £3.10 to bury their children in a consecrated space. It came too late for the dancers who paid sixpence to move across a floor that sagged and stank and buckled under the weight of the dead. Stand on the corner of Clement's Lane today, near the roar of Aldwych traffic, and you can still find the plaque. It is small. The words are spare. They tell you that Enon Chapel stood here between 1823 and 1844. They do not tell you about the cellar. But if you kneel and press your palm to the pavement, you are touching ground that once held 12,000 people. You are standing on soil that was soaked with their remains, that absorbed their bones, their hair, their clothes, their names. The road is modern. The pavement is clean. But the earth beneath remembers. London buried its dead wherever it could find space, in churchyards, in cellars, in gardens, in pits beneath markets and hospitals and schools. And then it built over them. The city rose on layers of the forgotten, and it did not stop to ask what it was standing on. Enon Chapel was closed. The Burial Act was passed. The cemeteries were built. And London learned, slowly, that the dead and the living cannot share the same ground. The plaque is still there. Most people walk past without noticing.